Such a pleasure to be here tonight. With me is my husband, Jay Thomson.
And I've shown a few people, but I get to wear this T-shirt, and if you're not in the front row, it says Keeper's Husband. When we had tours, I would tell people, yeah, I might be the only keeper's husband, but historically there were very few of us, because usually you'd be a widow or a daughter that already knew how to take care of the life. So be it.
And I'd like to introduce Ben. Ben, would you please stand up? Ben was actually active duty, being out at the light as one of the engineers to make sure that everything was running properly out there. And it was left to me. And boy, have I missed you. So what are the chances of being invited to Monson and having Ben come? And he came all the way down from Maine. And this is your dad?
Yeah, this is my dad, Dave O'Brien, and this is his hometown. It's really great to have you in Monson.
So we're just so excited to see you, Ben. Oh. All righty, so Jay, you'll be over here, I'll be over here. And so...
Most people have no trouble hearing me, so I usually get told to pipe down.
And I've mentioned a number of times what a beautiful library. It's amazing. You're so fortunate to have had those individuals that created all of this, and in such a warm welcome. So thank you. All right, well, I'm Sally Snowman, and I call myself the first and the last. The Boston Light out at Little Brewster Island, as the Seagull flies, it's 8 nautical miles out to the island. By boat, it's 10, because you don't want to go aground or hit another island or what have you. And so when I got hired, it was going to be a temp job for 18 months for 2 years. And 20 years later, I was still on the payroll. And this was a huge surprise for me because it wasn't anticipated. At the time, I was a college professor teaching teachers how to teach. And then as a Coast Guard auxiliary volunteer, so the Coast Guard has active duty, which Ben was, and reservists, volunteers, and then the Coast Guard auxiliary, civilian, and then the Coast Guard auxiliary. So Jay and I met in the Coast Guard auxiliary, and that's the uniform we wear today. And
apart from the active duty reserve, unless you really know what to look for.
So Jay and I met in the auxiliary, and we were doing boating stuff out in Boston Harbor together, and we're just tooling by Boston Light, because what we do in the auxiliary, we use our pleasure boats, and we offer them to the Coast Guard, and we put U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary Patrol on it, and we have a flag, the whole 10 yards. We have our uniform.
Can you hold up on that a little bit? We can go into it later.
Okay. Well, so anyway, with the Coast Guard Auxiliary as a volunteer, I met Jay. And we were tooling around the harbor doing a patrol. And I said to Jay, I've always wanted to get married at Boston Light. And Jay said,
Let me know when.
And just about a year later, because it was in August in 1993, and we got married in October of 1994 on the island. And when we were there, we were talking to the keeper and the other active duty that were there, and said, how do we get to volunteer out here? We know that auxiliaries come out, but we don't know the mechanism. So we made a reservation to go out in November, and we love history so much that we just scoured the island, looking in every little creek and corner to see if there was anything of interest. And then we went to the mainland, and we did 5 years of research, and we sandwiched it between 2 books, 2 covers, and we have so we have a sample of it over here on the table if you want to take a look later. And so with that, In 1996, the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park was established by Congress. And there are Little Brewster Island, Boston Light, is one of those islands. And it's military. However, within their congressional law, it said that they have to allow for tours to come out by the Park Service. And that's where we got heavily involved, because in 2000, that was our first run of the mill for these tours by the Boston Harbor Islands National State Park, with the ranger coming out. And then what happened in 2001, we had 9/11. And what happened at that time was that there were 3 active duty that was assigned to the island, and they were taken off the island to do important port security in Boston. And when it was allowed for the Park Service to start opening up for tours again, they wanted to come out to Boston Light. And because there were no active duty there, they were in Boston doing waterways patrols. They said to Sally, because I was one of the people that created the tours that were going out there as an auxiliary volunteer. They said, Sally, you've trained and you've worked with the Coast Guard active duty, and we want to have tours. So they went all through the chain of command, and they said, okay, Sally, you can go out there with your auxiliarist and give tours with the Park Service. And then the Coast Guard went down to Congress and said, we need to have a civilian keeper of the light, because we are now part of the Department of Homeland Security. Before it was with the Department of the Treasury.
Transportation,
Pardon?
Department of Transportation.
Oh, transportation.
Oh, if we were ever part of the Treasury, that would have been different.
No. Actually, when you read our book, we once upon a time was part of that. So it's making a long story short, that I started out as a volunteer, and then in 2003, when the Coast Guard went and did a national search, approximately 1,000 people applied for it. I threw my hat in, my bonnet, and won the Cupido on that. And when the captain called me and said, you know, you're number 1 being asked, and there was complete silence on the phone, and he said, Sally, are you there? And I said, yes. I said, I don't think you picked the right person. And so, no, thank you, but no thank you. And then he said, well, think about it for another minute. And then I came back and said, yeah, I couldn't do that for 18 months for 2 years. I can just take a leave of absence from the college and go back to work there. Well, that never happened. So now, 20 years, I'm now retired. The island is no longer manned after 203 years, minus 8 years of the Revolutionary War. So I'm the first female keeper in that 307 years, and I brought closure to having it been manned. And Boston Light was the only manned or woman light keeper for decades.
That blank, Sally is the last Coast Guard keeper.
So you always have to say Coast Guard, because the lighthouse is being transferred to other entities, so they all have their keepers or head people, what have you.
Okay, now you ready to go back?
Yes.
To the beginning? We jumped into the book.
Yes. All right, this is Little Brewster Island. It's 1.5 acres at high tide and about 3 acres at low tide. And this is it, folks. And here are the buildings and what they were, and they still are. And at the far left is where the pier is. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see what look like white dinosaur eggs. That is where we, in the Boston area, have, that's all our sewage treatment. and then if you...
Most of you are probably old enough to remember that great song, Love That Dirty Water. Well, this is what cleans
And so,
It was a federal order.
and just to the left of that is the city of Boston. And when Little Booster Island was chosen to have the first lighthouse established in colonial America, people always say, you know, look at the big island behind there. Why did they put the lighthouse there on a little island? And we're going to tell you that story. So in 1716, we had a light station. And then in 1719, the keeper that came out at that time, who were on ships a lot, he was a ship's captain. When he was on a ship and sailing around the world, they would be listening for any boats ships that were out there in heavy fog or rain or snow, because we had no GPS back there or radar or anything else. And so what they used to do on shipboard, when they were sailing along and couldn't see their hand in front of the boat, they would fire off a black powder, so that they had a little cannon on the boat that wasn't used per se for war. They would just fire it off for ba-boom, and they'd listen. And if they heard another ba-boom, they'd go, oh my goodness gracious, there's a ship really close by. We have to drop sail, we have to change our course. Or if they didn't hear something, or it was further out to sea. And so when he came to the island, he requested a cannon to
Answer, ships in the fog.
and so that cannon, we're going to see that. A lot of people just think we had lighthouses. They don't even know about fog signal devices. And we're getting back here to the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. There's 4 colors there. There's gray, white, green, and then a red dotted line. And the gray is for the land, the white is the water, the green is the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, which are 34 islands and peninsulas. And so when the Boston area was being colonized.
One of the versions I have has a little circle that shows up and lights up Little Brewster Island where Boston Light is, but I guess this isn't that version.
Okay. So what we have here is the king over in England. At that time, the Great Britain was the biggest naval entity on the planet. And it's an island. England's an island, Great Britain. So what they was doing is they had already cut down all the big trees to build ships. So the king said, hey, go west, go to New England and come back with lumber. And so that's how we came to be colonialized back then. So 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, they came, and they needed to take a hard right rudder around all these islands and then go through the Narrows. See
that printing that you can't read says the Narrows.
And then go into Boston. So when they were saying we need to have a lighthouse because we've had a lot of shipwrecks and we lose not only the ship and the goods, but also the people. The people wasn't as important as the cargo and the ship itself. And so they needed to decide where are they going to put this one lighthouse. And they chose Little Booster Island because as you come across that 3,000 miles, you take a hard right rudder. If you undershoot it, you're going to land on these islands here. They're not really islands, they're ledges. And the ship cracks open like an eggshell and loses all the ship and the people and the goods. And if they overshoot it, they land over here, Nantasket, the town of Hull, which are not ledges. There's some sand, there's some gravelly, some stones, but not enough to destroy a ship. So they put it here. And this is where it was important to have that bell there, that fog signal bell that we'll be talking about, so that as they were coming in, that they would know when to make that turn.
So what it amounts to, in 1713, they did what today would call a need study. 1715, they financed it. In 1716, the light was lit. Just the way we do things today, right?
And the first keeper and a friend and family, they drowned the second year of duty. And then the replacement, temporary, died within 3 days. So this.
Credit for being the second keeper. It was never officially appointed.
It had a rough start, to say the least.
The other thing, while we've got this slide up, is in the middle of the 19th century, this area called the Narrows, they complained it was too narrow. The ships were bigger and faster. So between 1880 and 1900, they dredged and blasted the ship channel that goes in this area where it says Massachusetts Bay. That created the need for Graves Light. And the other thing that I find interesting is they just went and dredged and blasted the same thing for the Panamax ships.
The huge ships, yeah.
Because the new ships coming through the canal have a deeper draft. History repeats itself.
So with, Jay mentioned that we have another lighthouse that's up here, and that one is privately owned right now, but it still aids to navigation. All the Coast Guard does is maintain the light and the fog signal. And the same when the transfer is going to happen at some point in time to the Park Service. Once again, the Coast Guard still today goes out there on routines to make sure that both of those devices are functioning properly. And I have to chuckle at this picture because the island is, it has a lot of ledge and rocks and what have you. In the rendition of this, they have this tree here. There was no way that that tree could have grown that high because what the tall of the tree, it has the roots at the same depth. I mean, they're the seams. So for this to be here, there wasn't enough soil for that tree to be there.
So this one we talk about artist license.
But what's good about this one is that the lighthouse is on the east end of the island. The pier is over to the left, the keeper's house, and then the back is the outhouse. And here's the cannon that came on board, was there from 1719 to 1851.
And our first question is, 1719, how did he get a cannon out there? Well, the answer to that was because of the metals they were built out of. You could only fire them under load so often, and you'd have to worry if you were the gun crew about the gun blowing up and killing you. So this is what was referred to as a shot-out cannon.
And so to have that used as that fog signal till 1851, that was a long time. And when ships first came over the Atlantic Ocean, they were very slow. And then they were able to use technology to be more efficient. So when the keeper was firing this off back in 1719, it was just once an hour, or if he heard of a boom, he would return that boom. And so to have this here for that many years with a new technology, this was a family station. There was the keeper, the wife, the kids, maybe a slave. And so did they take turns to stay up over the night to fire this off? Of course, there's no records of that. It's unknown. And the cannon was on the island until 2018. And I'm just going to do a side put over here, that when I took the job and they said, Sally, you're in charge of the antiques on the island, the artifacts. And they had a special form for me for the canon. And it said that it could not be where anybody could touch it. It had to be in a controlled environment, yada, yada, yada. I sent it back down to headquarters and said, I can't sign this. There's no way that I can do that. And we're going to show you a picture of where that cannon was. In 2018, it finally came off the island. It's been refurbished, and the Coast Guard's building a $2 billion Coast Guard museum, and it's going to be on the aids to navigation deck and front and center. I'm so pleased. That was my wish. My wish came true. And then we talk about, all right, so they built the...
So the lead into this picture is they asked Sally, as the 300th anniversary came up, what can we do for you? And Sally said, make the place look good.
Make the place, yes, the place was looking pretty shabby in 2014.
So one of the many things they did was they repointed the tower. And the estimate was, they're going to go in maybe an inch. Well, these blocks are like 8 inches deep, and many of them needed that restoration full depth.
So Jay, continue, because you like to talk about that.
Well, I was going to let you talk about the old tower.
Oh, okay. So when we had the Revolutionary War, the British blew up the tower. And
we embarrassed them by lugging those cannons up onto Dorchester Heights. They were a little miffed. Plus the fact many people didn't know, we sent colonial troops out and took over the island not once but twice. So they were a little embarrassed. And the last thing they did was...
Okay, so they
put a keg of powder in.
At the base of the tower, and they blew it up. But however, when the tower was rebuilt in, you know the date,
1783. If you're into history, that's the same year we signed the treaty officially ending the Revolutionary War. Well, the tower was being rebuilt before the paperwork got signed.
So anyway, if we always thought that the tower wasn't totally obliterated because it took them so few months to rebuild it. And we have evidence from 2014.
So when they
you look
took
down,
that stucco finish off, if you look closely, you can see the stones at that base are much different than the ones above. The ones above, the granite was faced off and regular.
So if you see here, they're sort of rounded. And then once we get up to 1783, they're more rectangular and more finished. So we said, aha, we know the first 9 to 14 feet of the tower is the original. We have evidence of it, and you're looking at it.
And having an engineering background, I love this one. The reason the tower was whitewashed was to take and keep the water away from the joints and stuff. Well, if deferred maintenance, the water got behind, so one of the things the contractor did was constructed this arch, took the stones that were under it, marked them with a piece of keel, crayon, and then they took them down, because they were worried about the crayon coming off, they did a marker, and then they did the repair work, and you can see the rubble stone that the tower is made of, and then they put them all back like a jigsaw puzzle.
And so the tower is 7 feet thick at the bottom and 2.5 feet thick at the top. Why is that? Because that's what they had for technology back in the 1700s.
And it doesn't shake or wobble.
And this is one of my favorite sketches here. The cannon is actually where it would be to get fired off during fog or inclement weather, what have you. And the two things that were first transported back to England was
We talked about one. Come on, timber.
the trees. The second one was cod, and we have a fisher person down there. And it's a good rendition of the island because there's no trees there. The island is on this east end. That's where it's the highest point on the island, and where the keeper's house is settled, standing, that is also accurate for that time. And so finally, the cannon gets replaced with a fog signal bell. And that occurred in 1851 to 72. So that was a short period of time to have the bell compared to what the cannon was. And the other thing that happened in that same time period is the lens that's there. That's the same one that's in the tower right now at this time, rotating 24 hours a day, sending a beam of light that you can't see in the daytime, but during the night, it's 27 miles on a clear night. And this is one of the favoriteest things I used to love to do, is clean that lens. That I would be up there singing with it because it had all these squeaks, squeaks, squeaks as the rotates, and we have a picture of what those rotations look like. But that is the one today, since 1859.
A little aside on the bell. The bell wasn't always out at the light. In fact, it was at the Cape Cod National Seashore. And when they did their historical research, they said, there was never a bell out here. So they sent, Sally, would you like a bell?
And I said, sure.
And then we had to display it. And some gentleman in this room helped us greatly with this. He found a construction firm in Maine that built that. And when we went to take and see what the preservative was, the Coast Guard said, we're not paying for that.
But the bell is there today in that stand. And we don't have the clapper on it because we don't want visitors, you know, or trespassers.
When we had shows, we had a rubber mallet and we'd let them bang it with that. And if you do it with the palm of your hand just right, you don't sting your hand, but you can get the bell to tone.
And we have a keeper's house on the left and one on the right. The one on the left is from the 1850s,
Yeah.
was
When
that built.
When they put the fog signal bell in, which needed all the mechanism to work, and they put the Fresnel lens in, which was maintenance intensive, they couldn't get away with turning the job to the keeper and his family. So they had to take and hire assistant keepers.
And so the building that we're looking at was first built in 1850s. So the principal keeper would be on the left, furthest away from the fog signal, and the assistant was on the right. So there would be a husband, a wife, a gaggle of kids. And then as we came into 1895, it's the same house on the right-hand side. Now they raised the tower 14 feet, and they also raised the roof to this keeper's house. And it was a good thing they did, because at one time there were 3 keepers, 3 wives, and 19 kids living on a 1.5 acre island at high tide. And 3, yeah.
A single outhouse for the keeper. We got indoor plumbing in the 60s.
And in New England area, many people have heard of the Flying Santa. Have you heard of the Flying Santa? Yes, no. Well, the thing is that whole shtick started up in Maine. And it was done by a mail plane that would be going to the islands up in Maine to deliver the mail. And so he had this idea to dress up like Santa Claus and around Christmas time deliver the mail with gifts for the kids and the keeper and the wife. And to this day, they're still flying Santa. Instead of going to lighthouses and delivering them, they go to the Coast Guard stations. And it's from Maine all the way down to, I think they go as far down as to northern, down in New York, right on the border there.
The lighthouse at the end of Long Island Sound.
And so Edward O. Snow was the one that took on this project in 1939. And he didn't have a plane, he never flew, so he'd have to rent one. And he is hanging out the window here and dropping, here, Jay, could you point the...
Just see it. In the package, it's either here or here. And that's what it looked like when it came down.
And then one of the keepers would go out, get the bundle, and they'd go in and hand out candies and dolls and trucks, little toys.
This picture actually shows the duplex outhouse.
Now you can see how small the island is, where we have the building in the front, that's a fog signal building. We have the tower, we have the keeper's house, and we have another one is the cistern building. So once upon a time, the way that they made the sound for the fog sound was through water. We're using water to steam to make a steam siren.
With steam-powered fog signals. And they had to have 2 engines, 2 fog signals, so if one needed repairs, the other one would work.
And so where did they get the water from? From the heavens. And what they did is they built that building, and they have a huge tank in there, 22,000 gallons tank. And that's what was used during that time. And if the keepers in each of their house, they had a cistern of 2,000 gallons. If they were caught taking any water out of the main cistern, that keeper would have been gone. And we didn't drink that water because birds sit on it, they do their poopies, the rain comes down and puts it into the cistern. So no, the question is, when I was living out there, did you drink that water? No.
We did use it for dishes and the toilet and everything else, but how restrictions keep coming, they said you can't even do that.
And this is a great picture of the island. When you're looking, well, Boston's going to be to the west, and you'll notice that there's a pier there. The principal keeper's house is behind the boathouse, and this is the first picture that we show that there's another house on the island. And Jay had already mentioned earlier that with the technology, they needed more help. So it went from one keeper to an assistant keeper to a second assistant keeper.
So to point it out, again, the fog signal is here, the second assistant keeper lived here, first assistant here, and the keeper was furthest away.
And this was a time when they had the 3 keepers, 3 wives, and 19 kids on the island. Amazing.
If you look at the bottom one, very typically in boathouses at lakes, they had rails because you wanted to get that boat out of the water and into the boathouse as fast as you could. And the other thing Ben will appreciate in this one, 2 things. One, those granite corner posts are still there, although they're surrounded by water. And Ben, that was what the sheep pile looked like at one time.
So
Doesn't look like that now.
Because our weather comes from the west, and the pier was when weather came, it would come right to this part of the island. And so by having supports on either side to make calm water, so they could get the boat onto the rails and into the boathouse.
It wasn't great, but it was the best place to try to land a boat.
And, thinking, some people say, well, why didn't they have the pier on the east side of the island? Well, that's on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. That gets hammered too. And so what happened in 1960? They created the Lighthouse Modernization Program, which resulted in no more families on remote islands or peninsulas or what have you. So that's where it became a stag station for men only, and the women and the children had to go to the mainland. And because Boston Light was only a mile away from the town of Hull, that they would go to school in Hull, and they would row across that 1 mile every day and come back, except for sometimes weather came in and they couldn't come home. And the town of Hull really supported the keepers on Boston Light. They helped them out any way, shape, or form. So one family had 9 kids, so a family might take 1 or 2 of those. So they would be around the town there.
If you ever go to the town of Hull, which you can't get to from anywhere, the police cars actually have Boston Light, the town seal. If you look at the fire truck, that's a different story. That's Joshua James, who was a famous lighthouse.
You're talking a different entity here. Okay, there's another entity, and it was
life-saving service.
It was a life-saving service that was right across that 1 mile from Boston Light. And the way that, because there was still shipwrecks happening out on the ledges over the years, that when the keepers at Boston Light saw a shipwreck on one of those islands, they had a flag that would hoist up the top of the flagpole, and that would be a cue for the life-saving service to launch their boat and come out and see if they can save the people, if not the boat. And this is an area of Little Brewster Island at low tide. If you notice, it's connected to Great Brewster Island. And I took this picture. And how did I do that? If I'm the keeper of the light, what was I doing?
It has a little touch to this.
And so there is a helicopter owner, pilot, that actually is one that delivers Santa and the gifts to the islands in the Boston area. And this was a day where we had tall ships that come by every 4 years. And they were leaving Boston Harbor. They were going to be racing up to Canada. And the fog set in. And so they held off on the start of the race.
Coast Guard said, you can't start yet, you gotta wait.
And so the helicopter came and landed on the island.
Didn't want to burn fuel until they started the race.
And well, they were in the fog too. And then once it started clearing, he was getting in with the photographer, and he said, Sally, would you like to see the start of the race? And I said, I'd love to. So that's where I took the picture.
And if you look right here where this circa 1928 nun is, that's where the duplex was before they burned it down, because that was the best way to get rid of it when they got rid of it.
Okay, and people say, well, Sally, how did you get to the island? Well, the same way it has always been.
We couldn't afford a helicopter, so we had to go by boat.
So there's the pier, and this is our 20-foot boat. And one of the things that I did every spring was put in marigolds. They're the only things that survived out there. I tried all sorts of plants.
And 1 year they didn't survive, and we realized that the seas had come up and they pickled the area with salt, so we had to take and replant them.
So take a look at the front of that pier, because when the Park Service brings out their tours, there is a dock and there's a gangway to come up onto the island. So just remember what this looks like. It's only 16 weeks out of the summer that that dock is there. All the other times, that's what you do, you go up the ladder. And so it's tide dependent, it's weather dependent, it's sea conditions. It can be pretty tricky. And so now we're going into the tower. When you're at the east end of the island, you're on the grounds, you're at the door to go into the lighthouse. You walk
We call
in.
this section the museum, but at one time that's where they stored the oil for the lamps and extra wicking. And we actually have a photograph that shows that. And this is why Sally couldn't sign the paperwork.
Yeah, so here's the cannon. And comfortably, like 8 people might be in there. And so when the rangers were doing tours, even the ranger would be leaning on this, and others would be hanging their backpacks or whatever off the muzzle, and I would just cringe at this. And the other thing is that this is not climate controlled. It would get very cold in the wintertime, and just the extent of weather here, what have you. So I'm so grateful that it's finally going to have due viewing.
A little point of interest, because we've got more than one coastie in here. This display case, that was done by Ken Black, who started the museum that's up in Rockland, Maine.
Okay. All right, so moving right along, Jay. Yes, you're going down there early lane now. All right, so we go up our 76 spiral stairs, up to a landing, up the ladder, into the gear room, and then we have another ladder that goes into the lantern room.
And Ben, I think you remember what color the stairs were before they got painted white.
Continental gray?
Yeah, battleship gray. There's plenty of that paint left around.
And so once you get into the gear room, this is the lower part of the whole mechanism. And the original pieces to this since 1859 are still there. This piece here, this here, the one down here. What gets replaced too frequently are these wheels here. They're chariot wheels. There's 8 of them. And they wear down, they get flat, and they have to be replaced. And the way that they did this back in 1859, whatever they did for the metals, we're not doing it in the 21st century. And they're wearing down about every 6 months. And it's becoming a high cost.
The other thing, back in 1859, we're pretty sure that the flash sequence was every 30 seconds. And I haven't been able to tie it down, but I think it's when they took the families off and electrified the mechanism instead of using a grandfather clock type weight, that they, with the 1/2 horsepower electric engine, they speeded it up. So then when they automated it, it was on 24/7.
And so we have the ladder that's going to go up into the lantern room. And I love the picture on the left. Doesn't it look like it's an eye with eyelashes looking over the harbor? No fear. And then the one on the right, there are 12 panels to the Fresnel lens. We can only see 3 there. However, what it shows is the circle part. And so when at nighttime, what you see is just a flash. You don't see the rays per se unless you're on the island or very close to the island. And I just loved getting the dust off of the lenses. And when we had the tours, when people were coming up and down, they're bringing all sort of dust and dirt with it. So it really had to be gingerly wiped down once a week. And then we are back down into the gear room. We're looking up into...
If you look closely, this is the light that's lit. there's a backup light. If the primary light goes off, it's supposed to automatically ratchet around 180 degrees and only be out for a split second. Well, without active duty out there anymore, it gets a little cranky. You know, mid-19th century technology, 21st century, they've actually, this was the lamp that was out there when we started coming, and they've gone through many iterations because this, you know,
Jay, we have to
supply and
keep
demand.
going. But can you go back, please? Because that you're looking at 336 individual prisms. It was made in France, shipped across the Atlantic Ocean in crates, and then reassembled at the top of the tower. And they are all 336 are the original.
I'm chipped in crack.
Jay slid this one in. Okay.
Yeah, this is the one you already told the story.
Okay. All right. So we got married out of Boston Light, and we.
$1 million insurance policy for 24 hours.
But we were auxiliarist, and we asked, how do we get permission to do this? And it was the ticket to buy the insurance. All right. So then we get into the National Park Service and their fundraising agency, Boston Harbor Now. And they did the tours out there from 2000 to 2017, except for the time that they were doing the refurbishing of the buildings in 2014. We couldn't have tours during that time. And the boat on the left was the first one that was used for the Park Service tours out here. And there's so many agencies that are involved in the Park Service, Boston Harbor Island National Park specifically. And so UMass Boston is part of that partnership, and the boat on the left was the boat that brought the Ranger out with the passengers, and the name of the boat was the Hurricane. And one of the funny things that would happen is the boat typically didn't stay tied up at the dock because sometimes the seas were just too much, it would just be banging against it. So the boat would go and then come back and get the passengers. So we would be seeing the Hurricane coming back to the dock. So we'd say, oh, you gotta come now, the Hurricane's coming. And then that boat there, while we were using that boat on the left, this one was being made to replace that one. So this is the one that would be used today if we were having tours out there. And that's called the Columbia Point.
You know, the active duty was out there.
Jay, you gotta put it back.
No, you don't.
There you go.
The active duty that was out there, they either loved it or hated it. Well, Ben was one of the ones that really liked the isolation of being out there and the nature of it. And when the Park Service came in, he became one of the partners.
And so one of the things that we knew is that the Coast Guard was going to transfer Boston Light to the Park Service. So here Ben is in his Coast Guard uniform with a Ranger's hat on. So this was the announcement that, this is really going to happen. Well, it's 2025 and it still hasn't happened. But that was the poster child for the transfer. And this is what the original pier or dock that we used back in 2000.
Another partner was Massport Authority until the Park Service was able to construct a permanent pier system. This floating bargee type thing was loaned by the Massport.
And if you notice, see how I call it beefy? That was a huge device on the upper left.
It was like 40 by 80
It was 40 by 80 feet. This one is 10 feet by 50. So when the boat comes in to drop off the visitors, we can only have 6 people on the dock at a time. So it's not like just stepping off.
It slides up and down so that this moves about an inch or so and stops. The old barge was moored so it would move around a bit.
And for this, for that, the Park Service had to fundraise, or however they get their money, $1.8 million for that 10 by 50-foot dock. All right, so what happened in 2000? We need to do some training. So we have a ranger in the front, I'm standing in the back in my uniform, auxiliary uniform, and walking around the island. A manual was written by me that to talk about specific things at different sites on the island. And
this is the one Sally printed on that. She's in there.
And then in 2003, I got hired, and there's Ben. Ben's right there. And then, we always have to talk about the Coast Guard mascot. The mascots are the black lab dogs. And so we had Sammy out on the island. And he was a purebred, and he lived for 14 years, so it was pretty healthy. He had been at 2 other Coast Guard stations before he came to Boston Light. And in 2004, at the end of the season, Jay and I, we took our boat into Boston for me to do some paperwork there. And we came back, and Sammy always greeted us. He didn't come, and I said, uh-oh, something's not right. We go up to the keeper's house, and he fell asleep and didn't wake up. So he's buried on the island, and we had a little marigold garden for him for the years that I was out there. And then we have talked about the Park Service tours. However, the congressional law also said that there had to be an opportunity for other visitors to come to the island, and we call it drive-bys. And they could be in small boats, they could be a kayak, they could be a cabin cruiser that comes up to the dock, unload their guests, and the boat goes away and then comes back. And that was always done between tours. So the tours were Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and the drive-bys could come in between the 2 of them. So it was a long day for all the staff that was out there. It was busy. And then other people have said, well, how do you get things out on the island, like when things break down or what have you? Well, here we have a Coast Guard helicopter that's bringing in a big, huge container with new windows for the keeper's house. The keeper's house was very drafty, and having the new ones in there made a huge difference. And then they say, well, Sally, you know, what do you do as the keeper? If it's all automated, what do you do? Whatever you do at home, you mow the lawn. One thing I don't have to do is clean out the sewage treatment plant. And this was after you've been. They changed the rules, and the poop had to get scooped out once a week. And then they had a third-party person come out once a month to do the shtick. And they bring out big buckets, and I would fill the buckets, and then they would take the full ones and leave me empty ones. And there were some auxiliaries that were offering to do that. I would not let them do it. I did it. And then what do we do for water? Because we can't reuse it for that in the cisterns. So we go pick up water in 5-gallon jugs, bring it to the marina, put it on the boat, come out to the island, take it off the boat, up the gangway at high tide, and then we have to lug it all down to the cellar of the keeper's house.
The trivia is the average tidal swing in the Boston area is 9.5 feet. That's the average.
And then the calm before the storm. Isn't that awesome? And then we had this. During the wintertime, we were able to go out there to do winter watches. If we did a 10-day stretch of weather and if it looked all okie dokie, we could go out there. Well, one day, the Coast Guard was bringing us out, and we said, no, not safe. We went back to the station. And then we were on an island, one of the assistant keepers with me. Her name was she's still alive. She is Audrey. And
Her mother's still alive.
yeah, Audrey's still alive too. And we were on the island when the storm hit. And I took pictures, and then once I got there to the mainland, I sent them into the Coast Guard base, and they said, "What were you doing out there?" So no more watches after
They said, "We can come and
2013.
get you in 15 minutes. You can't shut down a place like that in 15 minutes.
So what happened is there was no public access, and so what we're doing now, Jay, if we can move along here, because of the damage that was done in March of 2019, they then later in the season in October, they had experts come out to do some testing just all over the island, inside, outside, and we failed miserably. And I was told I could no longer be living on the island.
I bet Ben at his time there got to pitch a few rocks after the winter season. Where else can you do that?
And this is just some of the things, auxiliaries that had skills and had permission from the Coast Guard, they could do repair work. Look at this cookie monster here. Oh my gosh, we lost a big hunk of the island there. The two women down at the bottom here, they came up from Florida for a week to do the watch with me on the island, and all they did was pitch rocks off the came all the way up to Florida to pitch rocks in Boston Harbor. We're going to go back to the first and the last. Up in the upper left is George Worthy Lakes. He was the first keeper that died within his 2.5 years, and these are his descendants. And they came out, and I didn't know they were coming. The Park Service forgot to tell me to get a picture of them. And then I am the last keeper of Coast Guard Light Station Boston. This is the sunrise, sunset, Boston in the background.
And I like to put this one up because this shows where Sally is in the pecking order of longevity. And the other thing I found out, she's actually related to a couple.
And Jay and I were on watch, and he is the one that took that picture. And those are the 12 beams. Isn't that awesome? And that's cover of the book that we published in 1999. All right, so we usually try to end and have 15 minutes of Q&A. Our time is up. We did the full hour. However, do they have to leave right away? Okay, so that's good. Thank you. I'm going to hand the mic to Ben in case you would like to just stand up and.
Gosh, I have a lot to say. I haven't thought about Boston Light in a long time in detail, like your slideshow and your stories. I got to the island in March of 2000. I'll spare the dates, but basically it was the highlight of my 20-year career in the Coast Guard. It was also kind of a downfall because once you're on the island, your advancement in the Coast Guard, in the ranks, kind of slows down, which was okay. Life on the island was exciting, the storms, tours, people, the VIPs that would come out. What else?
Like I said, you either loved it or hated it. As somebody at the age Ben was when he was out there.
Yeah, so I was, let's see, my first trip out there, I was 20 years old. And we were test driving a boat we had just rebuilt. Get out to the island, had no idea that they were lighthouse keepers still. Took a tour and got back to the base in Boston and said, how can I get out there? Wrote a nice letter, and they said, you sure? it's kind of like a punishment, you know?
It truly was. In the 70s, if you were a bad boy, you got put on to a lighthouse.
But like I said, it was the highlight of my career, living on this tiny little island. Yeah.
I'm so grateful I got to see you.
I mean, every slide, I feel like the flying Santa. I remember going up in the helicopter with it. But yeah, just, my mind was spinning when I was watching this because I hadn't thought about it in 20 years.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's,
Does anybody have any questions? I'll hand you over the mic if you'd like.
Thank you.
Okay.
We'll hang around if you have some questions that you're shy to ask.
Yes, we'll be packing up, so feel free to come up and say hi to us. So thank you so much.